Everyone has a theory about how this war ends. The Hawks say it ends when Iran's military is broken and its nuclear program is destroyed. The Doves say it ends when diplomacy produces a deal that both sides can live with. The pessimists say it never ends, that the Middle East is condemned to permanent conflict, and that the best anyone can hope for is managed violence at a tolerable level. All three of these theories share a common flaw. They are all organized around what the parties to the conflict want the outcome to be, rather than what the structural logic of the situation will actually produce. And the structural logic, the hard, unsentimental architecture of military realities, economic constraints, domestic political pressures, and great power competition, points toward a final outcome that is more surprising, more consequential, and more instructive about the future of American global power than any of those three theories allows. Before we go any further, if this kind of final, structural, clear-eyed analysis is what you have been building toward across this entire series, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because this is the conclusion that everything we have been analyzing has been pointing toward. In this video, we are going to answer three questions. What does the actual final outcome of this conflict look like? Not as a desired end state, but as the product of the structural forces we have been mapping across this entire series. Why is that outcome more consequential for the United States and for the global balance of power than even the most pessimistic conventional analysis suggests? And what does it mean for ordinary people, not as abstract geopolitical actors, but as individuals whose economic security, physical safety, and future prospects are directly downstream of how this conflict resolves? Let's build the conclusion carefully, because it earns its weight only if it follows rigorously from everything that came before it. The headline version of how wars end in the Middle East is familiar and deceptively simple. One side runs out of weapons, or money, or political will, and it stops fighting. A ceasefire is declared. Diplomats meet, an agreement is signed that nobody fully believes, but everybody finds preferable to the alternative. The conflict moves from the front page to the analysis sections and eventually to the history books. The world moves on. This is the template that American strategic thinking has been applying to the current conflict, and it is the template that is most likely to produce a fundamental misreading of what is actually happening and what the actual final outcome will be. Because the conflict we have been analyzing across this series is not a war in the traditional sense that the ceasefire template was designed to manage. It is not a bilateral confrontation between two states with defined military forces, defined territory, and defined political leaderships that can sign an agreement and implement it through command authority over their respective military structures. It is a structural competition, a contest over the architecture of the regional order itself that is being conducted simultaneously through military means, economic means, diplomatic means, and the slow, patient reorganization of the relationships and alignments that determine which states have influence over what happens in the most energy-critical region on Earth. Structural competitions of this kind do not end with ceasefires and signed agreements. They end when one side's structural position has been sufficiently established and the other side's structural position has been sufficiently degraded that the competition's outcome is no longer in genuine doubt. That ending is not announced. It is recognized gradually, then suddenly, by the actors whose behavior collectively constitutes the regional order. The prior context for understanding the final outcome requires synthesizing everything we have analyzed across this series. We have established that the United States has been making a fundamental strategic mistake, conflating military superiority with strategic leverage, that has systematically produced costly military operations without the political outcomes that would justify those costs. We have established that Iran has identified and is exploiting America's biggest weakness, the gap between strategic ambition and domestic political will, with a sophistication and patience that reflects 45 years of direct study of the American political system. We have established that three specific countries, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, sit at the fault lines where regional war expansion produces its first and most consequential destabilizing effects. We have established that Iran's real plan is not a series of reactive tactical moves, but a comprehensive strategic sequence designed to transition the Islamic Republic from contained regional disruptor to co-architect of the regional order. And we have walked through the day 1 to day 30 timeline that shows how the mechanics of escalation and de-escalation play out in the critical opening phase of a direct conflict. The final outcome is what all of those threads produce when they reach their conclusion. conclusion. The media narrative tells you the final outcome is uncertain, that it depends on decisions not yet made, on events not yet occurred, on the choices of leaders operating in a situation of genuine strategic ambiguity. That framing is not wrong as a description of the surface, but underneath the surface, the structural logic of the situation is considerably less ambiguous than the uncertainty narrative allows. The forces we have been mapping are not random, they are directional. They are pointing toward a specific outcome with a consistency and a momentum that individual decisions and individual events can delay, accelerate, or shape in its specific texture, but cannot fundamentally reverse. Now let's run the final actor analysis, where each of the major players ends up and why. The United States does not end this conflict in defeat in any military sense. American military capability is not destroyed, not fundamentally degraded, and not rendered irrelevant to the regional balance. What the United States ends this conflict with is something more consequential and more difficult to recover from than military defeat. A strategic position in the Middle East that is structurally weaker than at any point since before the 1973 oil embargo, achieved at a cost in financial terms, in military resource terms, in domestic political terms, and in global credibility terms, that has left the domestic foundation of American strategic commitment more eroded than at any prior point in the post-Cold War period. The United States ends this conflict as a power that is present in the Middle East, that retains significant military capability in the region, and that maintains formal alliance relationships with key regional partners. But that is no longer the architect of the regional order. It is a participant in a regional order whose architecture is being negotiated among multiple powers, of which the United States is one, but no longer the dominant one. That transition from regional architect to regional participant is the final outcome for American strategic position. It is not a collapse, it is a demotion. And demotions in strategic terms are frequently more consequential than collapses because they are harder to reverse and easier to deny until the denial itself becomes a strategic liability. Iran ends this conflict in a position that is genuinely remarkable when assessed against where it started. In 1979, the Islamic Republic was an isolated revolutionary state surrounded by hostile neighbors, bereft of great power support, and facing an American-led international order that treated its existence as a problem to be managed and eventually resolved. 45 years later, the Islamic Republic has survived 8 American presidents, multiple rounds of the most intensive sanctions campaign in modern history, a catastrophic 8-year war with Iraq, multiple rounds of military strikes on its proxies and its territory, and the assassination of its most consequential military commander. It has built, from scratch, one of the most sophisticated asymmetric military capabilities in the world. It has constructed a regional network of non-state military forces that gives it strategic depth and escalatory options that no conventional military analysis at the founding of the Republic would have predicted. It has secured great power partnerships with China, with Russia, that provide the economic lifeline and diplomatic protection that sustain its strategic program through the periods of maximum pressure. And it is now, at the conclusion of the conflict sequence we have been analyzing, in a position to translate all of those accumulated strategic investments into the kind of structural regional influence that makes its continued independent existence not just survivable, but architecturally embedded in the regional order. Iran does not end this conflict as a victorious power in the triumphalist sense. Its economy remains damaged. Its military has absorbed significant attrition. Its proxy network requires resupply and reconstruction. Its population has borne enormous costs in terms of economic deprivation, physical insecurity, and the human toll of a 45-year confrontation with the world's most powerful military alliance. But it ends the conflict having achieved the central objective of its real plan. A regional order in which Iranian influence cannot be structurally excluded, in which American containment has been replaced by contested coexistence, and in which the next phase of the regional competition is conducted on terms that Iran's patient strategic investment has made significantly more favorable to its interests than the terms of the previous phase. China ends this conflict as the primary strategic beneficiary. And it does so without having fired a single shot, without having deployed a single soldier, and without having made a single public commitment that exposes it to the costs that military participants absorb. China's strategic position in the Middle East at the conclusion of this conflict is structurally stronger than at its outset across every dimension that constitutes actual regional influence. Economic relationships, diplomatic credibility, energy supply security, and the perception among regional states that Beijing is a reliable, consistent, and capable strategic partner in ways that Washington, with its cycles of engagement and withdrawal, its domestic political constraints, and its tendency to subordinate regional interests to its broader geopolitical competition, is not. China ends this conflict as the power whose regional influence has grown most during the period of the conflict. Not because it chose to engage militarily, but because it chose its strategic instruments more wisely than its primary competitor. Israel ends this conflict in the most genuinely ambiguous position of any of the major actors. On the military dimension, Israel has demonstrated, again, that its military capability is real, sophisticated, and formidable, that it can project power at range, absorb and inflict significant damage, and maintain operational effectiveness under conditions of multi-front pressure that would challenge any military force in the world. But on the strategic dimension, the picture is considerably more complicated. The military operations have not produced the political outcomes that would justify their costs in terms of the durability of the security environment they create. Hezbollah is degraded but not destroyed and will reconstitute on a timeline that is measured in years, not decades. The Iranian nuclear program has been set back but not eliminated, and the political commitment to it is stronger rather than weaker as a result of the military pressure. The regional normalization process that was supposed to provide Israel with a new strategic architecture, a set of normalized relationships with Gulf states that would reshape the Middle East in ways favorable to Israeli security, has been significantly disrupted by the conflict's consequences. Israel ends this conflict with military capability intact and strategic position in genuine question, a combination that creates exactly the kind of security environment in which the pressure for the next conflict begins building before the current one has fully resolved. Russia ends this conflict as a secondary but meaningful beneficiary, primarily through the demonstration effect that the conflict provides for its own confrontation with the Western sanctions regime. The proof of concept that a major economy can sustain strategic operations and maintain great power relevance despite comprehensive Western sanctions pressure, a demonstration that Iran has provided across 4 decades and that Russia has been building toward in its own sanctions response, is validated and strengthened by the Iranian strategic performance in this conflict. Russia also benefits from the American strategic distraction the conflict produces, which reduces the intensity and consistency of American engagement in the European theater, where Russia's primary security competition is focused. Now let's examine the structural facts that define the final outcome with precision. Structural fact number 1 is the irreversibility threshold and why the final outcome crosses it. Strategic outcomes become effectively irreversible, not when military operations cease, but when the relationship and alignment structures that constitute the regional order have reorganized to the point where reconstituting the prior arrangement would require more political, military, and economic investment than any single actor or coalition of actors can mobilize. The final outcome of this conflict crosses that threshold in 3 specific ways. First, the Gulf state hedging behavior, the Saudi, Emirati, and broader Gulf movement toward diversified security relationships that include Chinese economic partnership and managed Iranian normalization, reaches a point during the conflict where reversing it would require the United States to offer guarantees of strategic consistency and commitment durability that the American domestic political system cannot credibly provide. Second, the Chinese economic footprint in the region deepens during the conflict's disruption period in ways that create dependencies on both sides that are not easily unwound after the military phase concludes. Third, the Iranian nuclear latency, advanced during the conflict and surviving the military pressure directed at it, becomes the permanent background condition of the regional security environment. Not a crisis to be resolved, but a structural feature to be managed. Structural fact number 2 is the financial arithmetic of the final outcome, which is more constraining than the political narrative acknowledges. The combined cost of the military operations, the economic impact of the oil shock, the fiscal consequences of the emergency financial support required to prevent the collapse of fragile regional states, and the long-term cost of managing the proxy network reconstitution will be measured in the trillions of dollars across the full accounting period. That financial cost lands on an American fiscal position that was already under strain before the conflict and is further constrained by the domestic spending pressures that compete with defense budgets in the political process. The financial arithmetic of the final outcome is one of the primary mechanisms through which the conflict produces lasting damage to the domestic political foundation of American strategic commitment, not through any single expenditure, but through the accumulated fiscal pressure that makes sustaining the strategic ambition progressively less politically viable over the years following the conflict's military phase. Structural fact number 3 is the knowledge and institutional legacy of the conflict for each of the major actors. Iran emerges from the conflict with a significantly enhanced empirical knowledge base about American military capabilities, American decision thresholds, and the specific vulnerabilities in the American regional military posture that its operational planning can exploit in the next phase of the competition. The IRGC's institutional learning from the conflict is specific, detailed, and immediately applicable to the planning of the next phase. The American military and intelligence community emerges with equivalent learning about Iranian capabilities and thresholds. But the translation of that learning into updated strategy is constrained by the domestic political environment, the budget pressures, and the institutional processes that make American strategic adaptation slower than the pace at which Iranian strategy is already incorporating the lessons of the conflict into its next planning cycle. Structural fact number 4 is the non-state actor durability that is one of the most consistently underestimated features of the regional strategic landscape. The proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, does not end the conflict destroyed. It ends the conflict damaged, depleted in specific military assets, and temporarily reduced in operational tempo. But the organizational foundations, the political relationships, the recruitment bases, and the ideological commitments that constitute the network's long-term durability are intact. The resupply and reconstitution process begins before the military phase of the conflict has fully concluded. Within 2 to 3 years of the conflict's end, the network will have rebuilt its military capacity to levels comparable to or exceeding its pre-conflict capability, incorporating the operational lessons of the conflict into its reconstituted structure. This reconstitution timeline is not a surprise. It is a documented pattern from every previous conflict cycle in which elements of the Iranian proxy network were militarily degraded. The final outcome includes this reconstitution as a structural feature. The network is a permanent element of the regional security environment, not a problem that can be solved through a single military campaign. Structural fact number 5 is the global precedent effect of the final outcome, which is the most strategically significant consequence of the entire conflict sequence and the one that extends farthest beyond the immediate region. The final outcome of this conflict, an Iran whose strategic position has been strengthened rather than eliminated by 45 years of American pressure, a regional order whose architecture has shifted from American primacy to contested multipolarity, a proxy network that has survived military degradation and reconstituted to continue its strategic function, constitutes a demonstration, visible to every state in the world, of what patient, strategically coherent resistance to American pressure can produce. That demonstration does not require Iran to have won in any triumphalist sense. It requires only that the Islamic Republic has survived, maintained its core strategic program, and achieved a regional position that is structurally stronger than its starting point, despite the application of maximum American pressure across every available instrument of state power. That survival and that strengthening sustained across the timeline we have analyzed is the proof of concept for an approach to confronting American power that every state currently evaluating its relationship with Washington will study with close attention. The precedent effect of the final outcome is its most enduring and most consequential dimension. From this structural analysis, the final outcome resolves not into 3 scenarios of equal probability, but into a single most likely trajectory with 2 variant paths depending on how specific decision points along the way are navigated. The most likely trajectory is contested multipolar coexistence, a regional order in which American influence is real but no longer dominant. Iranian influence is structurally embedded and diplomatically recognized rather than contained and isolated. Chinese economic and diplomatic presence is the primary external driver of regional development, and the management of regional security is conducted through a combination of bilateral relationships, ad hoc multilateral frameworks, and the implicit deterrence provided by Iranian nuclear latency and proxy network capability. This is not a stable order in the sense that the post-1945 American-led international order was stable. It is a competitive, contested, continuously negotiated order in which multiple powers with divergent interests are managing their competition without the organizing framework that American primacy provided. Managing that competition without that framework is more expensive, more unpredictable, and more prone to the kind of miscalculation that produces crises than the prior order was. But it is the order that the structural logic of the conflict produces, and it is the order that the next generation of regional actors, American strategists, and global economic managers will need to learn to navigate. The first variant path is managed transition, a version of the most likely trajectory in which the United States makes the strategic adjustment we have discussed, accepts the contraction of its regional role to a defined and defensible set of core interests, and engages constructively in the construction of the new regional architecture rather than resisting it ineffectively. In this variant, the transition to contested multipolar coexistence is managed with less disruption, less cost, and less damage to the specific elements of American influence: Israeli security, Gulf energy access, non-proliferation architecture, that constitute genuine core interests rather than the full ambition of the prior strategic posture. This is the variant that produces the best achievable outcome for American interests given the structural constraints we have identified. It requires political courage, institutional honesty, and a willingness to publicly acknowledge strategic limits that American political culture makes genuinely difficult. But it is achievable. And the alternative, the second variant path, makes the cost of not achieving it painfully clear. The second variant path is contested decline, a version of the most likely trajectory in which the United States does not make the strategic adjustment, continues to pursue the full ambition of its prior regional posture with the diminished domestic political will and economic capacity available to sustain it, and produces a series of costly, ambiguous military and diplomatic failures that accelerate rather than reverse the erosion of American strategic position. In this variant, the transition to contested multipolar coexistence occurs on worse terms for American interests, with more damage to the alliance relationships, more erosion of the domestic political foundation, more strengthening of the Chinese and Iranian strategic positions than the managed transition variant would have produced. The final outcome is the same regional architecture. The difference is the American position within that architecture and the cost at which it was reached. The impact of the final outcome on ordinary people, American families, global consumers, citizens of the fragile regional states we have analyzed, is direct, material, and long-term in ways that deserve honest acknowledgement. The energy cost is the most immediate and most universally felt consequence. A Middle East organized around contested multipolar coexistence rather than American-backed stability is a Middle East in which energy supply security is more contingent, more subject to the competing interests of multiple actors with divergent priorities, and more vulnerable to the kind of political manipulation that the prior American-dominated order was designed to prevent. The global population that pays the cost of that increased vulnerability through higher and more volatile energy prices, through supply chain disruptions that cascade through every sector of the modern economy, extends far beyond the Middle East. It includes every household in every country whose economic functioning depends on stable and affordable energy, which is to say, it includes essentially everyone. The security cost is less immediately visible, but more structurally significant. A world in which the American-led security architecture that has underpinned the relative stability of the post-1945 international order is contested and partially dismantled is a world in which the probability of conflict, not just in the Middle East, but in every region where American security guarantees are the foundation of deterrence, is higher than in the prior order. The specific conflicts that become more probable in this environment, Taiwan Strait confrontation, Korean Peninsula escalation, Eastern European instability, each carry costs that dwarf the cost of the Middle Eastern conflict we have been analyzing. The final outcome of this conflict is not just a Middle Eastern story. It is a story about the resilience of the international order that has made the current level of global prosperity and stability possible. The generational cost is the one that deserves the most attention and receives the least. The final outcome of this conflict will define the strategic environment that the next generation of Americans, Middle Easterners, and global citizens will inherit. The regional architecture that emerges from the contested multipolar coexistence outcome With its higher conflict probability, its more volatile energy markets, its weakened non-proliferation norms, and its reduced American ability to shape outcomes in ways consistent with American values and interests, is the architecture within which the next generation will build their lives, their economies, and their security arrangements. The choices made now, in the period when the final outcome is still being shaped by the decisions of living actors rather than determined by the structural forces that have been set in motion, are choices about what kind of world the next generation inherits. My final analytical read on this conflict and its outcome, stated as directly as this analysis permits. The final outcome is not yet determined in its specific texture, and the choices made by American strategic leadership, Iranian leadership, and the regional actors whose behavior will collectively constitute the new order matter enormously for which variant path the trajectory follows. But the direction is clear. The structural forces we have mapped across this entire series, the American strategic mistake, the Iranian real plan, the exploitation of American weakness, the fragility of the regional fault line states, the 30-day escalation logic, and the long-term trajectory of great power competition in the region are all pointing in the same direction, toward a regional order that is more contested, more multipolar, more expensive to manage, and less favorable to American interests than the order that preceded it. The final outcome is not American defeat, it is American demotion. And the difference between accepting that demotion on managed terms and experiencing it on contested terms is the most important strategic choice that American leadership faces in the decade ahead. The signals that tell you which variant path is being followed are not dramatic single events. They are the incremental indicators, the budget allocations that reveal actual strategic priorities rather than stated ones, the alliance behaviors of Gulf states that reveal their actual confidence in American commitment durability, the diplomatic initiatives that reveal whether American strategy is adapting to structural reality or defending prior assumptions against mounting evidence of their inadequacy. Those indicators are observable now, updated continuously by events that the daily news cycle covers without the analytical framework required to interpret their significance correctly. Don't follow the headline, follow the pattern. If this final analysis delivered the conclusion that the entire series has been building toward the structural logic of how this conflict ends, why it ends that way, and what it means for the world on the other side of it, please like this video and subscribe, because the work of analytical clarity in a world moving at this pace and with these stakes is never finished. The story we have been tracing does not end with this video. It continues in the events of the coming months and years, and having the framework to understand those events as they unfold is the most valuable thing that this kind of analysis can provide. Headlines end, consequences don't. Stay analytical.